All right. So today we're going to talk about something called Stockholm syndrome, and I don't know how many of y'all have been in psychology, but I'm sure you'll probably heard of it if you have. Um, does anyone know what Stockholm syndrome is? All right, Matthew.
You know, you're held hostage and you start turning on the other hostages. Something like
Are
that.
you crazy? No, that's completely right. That's like, yeah, you're.
What is it?
I mean, it's essentially that. Don't worry, I'll explain. All right. So this is kind of how it all started. So back, I don't know when it was, but you know, a little ways. Remember that black and white photos sometime. Um, there was this guy. Huh? Yeah, I know. I told y'all we would.
We've been trying for 4 years.
Martin did it for us. But anyway, so there was this guy, and his name was Jan Erik Olsen, and he was some Swedish kid, and well, I don't know, he's older than that, but yeah. But anyway, he robbed a bank in Sweden, went in there and held up the bank, and so, he's holding it up and stuff, and somehow he gets into the vault, and he takes four hostages with him, um, and then he locks himself in the vault with the four hostages, and then he starts the process of negotiating with police, trying to get out of there. And so they're in this vault for 5 days. These people are just in this vault of this bank, and and I mean, this guy, Jan Erik Olsen, he hasn't, he hasn't like, hurt the hostages. He says, of course, he's going to kill them if the police try to, come into the vault or anything. And, but over time, um, some of these hostages actually, I don't know, they kind of became empathetic toward Jan Erik Olsen, toward the guy who said he was going to kill them, and they began to actually kind of side with him rather than the police. For instance, one time the prime minister of Sweden, he called. I don't know. I guess they had like a telephone in there, but anyway, he called them, and and like, well, at first I think Jan Erik Olsen had called the prime minister and like told him, he's going to kill these hostages and all this stuff if they don't let him go. And then the next day, the prime minister called him back, and actually one of the hostages answered the phone and was like, "Would you just leave us alone? Like, leave me and Jan Erik Olsen alone. Like, we don't want to be bothered by you." And she was like, it seems completely crazy that the police are trying to help these people, but they just want to be left alone, with their captor. And so eventually the police like drill a hole in this vault, and then they through that little hole they take a picture, and those are on the left. There's like three of the hostages you can see, and then that guy is actually not Jan Erik Olsen. He's one of his other like friends that Jan Erik Olsen like negotiated in there to help him out. So yeah, so essentially, after this, psychologists kind of diagnosed this kind of this phenomenon as Stockholm syndrome, and basically it's whenever you're put in a situation of intense danger and something really intense, and kind of your life depends on someone else's choice. Like just like these hostages, their life they were completely dependent upon Jan Erik Olsen for everything they needed for survival, because he held their life in his hands, and so then people began to perceive what is actually a lack of violence as kindness, and so the hostages, just because he didn't kill them, they were like, he's actually not a bad guy. He's nice. He didn't kill me, and though he did take them captive and he's using their lives to bargain, there's this phenomenon that people start to I don't know, start to see kindness in something that really isn't. And so that's kind of what happened. And they say like 30% or 27% of all like hostages like develop some form of Stockholm syndrome. And over time, there's been more cases where it's like it gets worse. Like there's people who get kidnapped by people and they'll live with them for like 18 years. You've heard about like those girls who get kidnapped when they're young, and they're in situations where they can easily tell someone, what's happened, can easily come out, but they don't because they've developed some sort of connection. Not necessarily that their captors being nice to them or they have like a good, good living with them, but they're not. Yeah, but they're not being completely. I don't know, completely evil, and so they begin to think, maybe they're not so bad. But so I think there's a good kind of relationship between the actual like psychological Stockholm syndrome and a spiritual Stockholm syndrome, and so we're gonna read a few verses. If anyone has their Bibles, they can turn to 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 through 20.
Great. First Corinthians what?
Chapter 6, verses 19 through 20. And
I got it.
Oh.
Alright, go ahead and
Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were brought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are God.
Alright, and John chapter 15, verse 16. And let's read that one. Alright, do you have it? John chapter 15, verse 16, you want to read it?
You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go to these everything so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for in your name.
Okay, so kind of the reason I wanted to share those two verses is because it's important in our lives that we don't forget who our team is, or who's on our side. And essentially, in those two verses, in the 1 Corinthians 1, Paul said that he said, don't you know your body's a temple of the Holy Spirit, and he says, remember that you were actually bought with a price, that like you were purchased, and therefore your body is not your own, and you should glorify God with your body. And then in John, Jesus says clearly, he says, I chose you, and that kind of, I don't know, that's just an emphasis for whose team we're on. And I don't know, the devil, in this case, he would be our captor, and he's not a captor that would would get a stronghold in our lives and would be he's going to be subtle. He's not going to be a fool. He knows what he's doing. He's not going to be the obvious case of evil, and so sometimes we fall into these traps, and we fall into we allow the devil to have strongholds on our lives, and then gradually over time we forget that he's there. We forget that he's the enemy, and that the team we're supposed to be going for doesn't have anything to do with those things that we're stuck in. Good.
You got to think about, like, a lot of people always think about people with that horns and pitchfork and bill, tail, he's all red. But, the Bible talked about him. He was actually one of the most beautiful angels, and that's why he was so prideful, because he was one of the best. And so he's probably not going to come up to you looking all devilish, as we describe it. But he'll probably be looking, like a beautiful person or a beautiful thing that you